Choosing to read, choosing to be a reader, is to choose to let go of the need for, or the urge for, the compulsion for immediate results, for finishing. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today we continue the Why Do We Read fiction series, taking our cue from Roger Grenier's A Palace of Books. First of all, this is an excellent compendium. Even though I am just taking small selections from it today for the specifics of this video, I highly recommend the full book. It's 9 incredible literary essays that are written with such command of subject. I mean, Grenier is an icon in French literature, French literary culture and industry as a publisher, an editor, a writer of nonfiction and fiction himself, friend of Camus, among many other luminaries. He's so enmeshed in the world of literature and has this great personality such that comes through in a style that makes the essays almost like bagatelles. It reminds me of Umberto Eco's essays, where he's just got such rich and deep knowledge of literature that he can take a question, he poses a question or a dilemma or a theme, a subject matter, and then explores it in the format of the original essay from Montaigne, in that he combs through the archives of literary culture to test out and illuminate the question or subject. But he's got this playful attitude and this keen wit that keeps everything light. That's why I say it's almost like a bagatelle. Yet, that's not to say it's just some dismissible trinket. Although reading these is like eating, I don't know, literary truffles. In his essay To Be Loved, for example, he talks about how my mother, worried about finding me always lying on my stomach on a rug, my nose in a book, took me to Bordeaux to consult a great medical specialist. She was afraid that so much reading would unhinge me. Even though the doctor made light of her fears, they were not entirely absurd. We know what happened to Don Quixote after reading too many tales of chivalry, after all. Nonetheless, please go out, get this book. If you like Umberto Eco, if you like Elizabeth Hardwick, if you like William H. Gass essays, please check out Grenier. But for this video, I want to focus on some items that popped up in his essay, Waiting and Eternity. And some of this will sort of go hand in hand with Anna Quindlen's How Reading Changed My Life and silence and solitude and stillness being partially at the heart of why we return to fiction again and again. But this really popped out at me. It seems that one of the first acts inseparable from waiting is reading. Your eyes follow the length of a line, and your mind waits for your eyes to advance, impatient to know what will happen next. But you have to be patient. So I started thinking about reading as waiting. And of course, it's a pleasurable waiting, a delayed gratification. And obviously, not everyone likes this. I think that patience versus impatience could be a big part of what's at the heart of people who want to spend hours and hours reading. But the more I thought about this, the more I realized that the very nature of reading books is hostile to impatience. It's in opposition to the need to finish. Choosing to read, choosing to be a reader, is to choose to let go of the need for, or the urge for, the compulsion for immediate results, for finishing. Reading, especially reading rich, imaginative literature, is one thing that you cannot rush and for which there are no shortcuts. Sure, there are speed reading programs. Mostly these types of shortcuts are when you're just trying to glean the main idea from nonfiction. And you've probably heard about techniques such as read the first chapter and the last chapter and then the first and last paragraph of all the pages in between. Yes, this is a great way for mining nonfiction, especially if you're a student, if you're working on a dissertation and you need to get through a ton of material related to your subject so you know what others have thought and said, then this is great. But we're talking about fiction. We're talking about imaginative fiction. We're talking about books for which there's so much more available to us as readers than just the main idea or what happens. And I kept thinking about this and kept thinking about this. And I thought about some of my own behavior and how it coincides with this concept of waiting, reading as waiting, as pleasurable waiting. And as I've said in other videos and my big books video, I've likened it to a relationship. And I really like big, long, dense books for the most part because it forces me to spend so much time with it. And this is something that I just absolutely enjoy. And I thought about some other things that I do. And one of them is that very often as I get towards the end of a book, even if I've got one chapter left and it's 2 pages long, I will often put it aside for hours, sometimes days, and just kind of live in that anticipatory suspension. I've talked earlier about books like Women and Men by Joseph McElroy, books that I want to read so urgently, but there's a sort of pleasure in holding off. There's a delayed gratification. I know how much I'm going to love that book. So it's sort of an extreme or acute version of what I'm talking about, because as if the books don't take long enough to finish, books just take a long time to read. They stunt, they thwart, they short circuit that need for immediacy, immediate results. And this is something that I have come to love and to appreciate. So many things, like in my job, it's just a push for numbers, KPIs, results, statistics, deliveries, milestones, delivering early and under budget, analyzing data as quickly as possible. Get through this, get through this, get through this. Everything around me in our commercial culture is pushing for now, 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 quickly, quickly, quickly. And then I get to sit down with a book and it just goes against all of that onslaught of rapidity and ephemera. And so I wanted to continue to chase this thought down. Grenier goes on, and towards the end of the essay, he makes this statement: misery is when there is no more waiting possible. And I just sat on that for a pretty long time. I brooded on it. I roosted. And I thought and thought, how does misery when there's no more waiting? And, I didn't want it to be just as simple as saying, okay, misery is no longer being able to read, and continue down this highly romanticized imputation to the act of reading, because I do that enough. But I thought that in reading, we seize hold of a peculiar waiting that, in a way, momentarily takes us outside of time. For there would be no concept of waiting if there is no time. To have time to wait is to have time to read, and thus to experience a form of eternity. We've heard again and again people talk about how reading transports them, how you become so immersed in a story, in a book, that you lose track of time. And I sat and I kind of ruminated on this. I chewed the cud of these thoughts and wondered how in the world to articulate them properly for this episode. And I continued reading through the book and got to an essay on unfinished works. So Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities. And then Grenier posed a question: is it better to be unfinished or finished? And I thought being unfinished means that you're still able to wait, that there's still pleasurable waiting possible, available. And I believe that it is thus better to be unfinished. Grenier gives us this little nugget about how Rodin often chose to leave his sculptures unfinished, to leave room for the imagination, to continue to just rampage through things and consume them one after another in rapid succession as we feel compelled to do or feel pressure to do often, hence binge watching. I think that this evokes or creates evocations of the imagination, but it doesn't leave room for the imagination to bloom as it does when you spend time with something or when you let go of the need to collect or finish. This is something that I believe books really afford us. A lot of what I'm saying I thought was pretty solid in my mind, but it's starting to feel like wet paint or the clay hasn't quite dried yet. But another example I can give is that very often I will be reading and I will come across something that's so evocative, so rich, that I will have to stop reading and close the book, close my eyes, and simmer on it for a while. And it can be such a pleasure to even wait days before returning to the book and resuming the journey. And I think that learning to embrace or lean into that approach to books can be so fulfilling and so rewarding. Now, I also will say that there are phases to the life of reading. Obviously, early on, I champion figuring out what you like and figuring out what your kind of personal canon is. And this often does take reading voraciously, reading widely and wildly. And there is often a sense of needing to get to everything right away, a sense of being always behind the curve. But again, the truth is that with reading, with literature, with books, with this life, you will never catch up. There's no finish line. You'll never finish all the books you want to finish in several lifetimes over. So eventually you get to let go of that need and lean into the act of reading as an act of waiting that paradoxically takes you outside of time. In the end, though, like Grenier says, one must finally come down from literary paradise and back to everyday life, where truth isn't any truer than in books, just more difficult to bear.